It's a joy for us to be here this afternoon, to be able to welcome and to be with our guests. As has already been indicated, the Vice Chancellor is part and parcel of the bigger Hesabika movement. He would have wanted to be here greatly, but because of the travel which he has just returned from last night, he was not able to be on duty today, and therefore he was not able to come. But he sends his greetings. I also want to take this opportunity to recognize all the members of faculty, Daystar, and students. I'm believing that many of you will still be coming so that we can together be able to hear what Dr. Schluter has for us. It's always a joy to hear of the founders, and you cannot talk about the founding of Daystar University without talking or without making reference to Dr. Mageria, who is here with us. He has already said hi to us. Dr. Mageria, we appreciate and recognize you. Thank you for being able to be here. The bigger issue here, of course, is the topic that is before us, transforming capitalism. But this is riding on the back of a bigger project, which I am sure Dr. Waithima will give space for just before the lecture is delivered to us, in order for us to appreciate and to be able to hear what it is that we are being invited to, and how possible is it for us to be able to be part of it. I think the bottom line is that the series of lectures that are being done and which are building up to a bigger conference which will be happening at Kenyatta University, I think at some point later, it's a bigger thing basically to invite us, the Christian community in this country, for us to begin to think together towards solutions that will not only be able to reflect the kingdom values, but solutions that ultimately will bring back to us the human dignity and a proper perspective towards the right understanding of personhood. I don't want to take a long time here. I just want to recognize our guests, Dr. Schluter, and to be able to say karibu sana to Daystar. As you have heard from Dr. Mutuki, Schluter has just indicated to me that and that the notes which he used, I want you to hear this, are still there. Maybe one of these days, sir, we may just invite you to come back and let's see how those notes fit into the Daystar of today. I'm sure they will find some place and some resonance among us. And so to bring to us our guest speaker today and to recognize some more people from the Hesabika team, I want to ask Mr. Cosmos Gatere to come and be able to do that for us, even as he invites our guest speaker today. Bwana Gatere, you're welcomed.
Think about what the Bible has to say about public social engagement, and if there are any principles that you can take out of Scripture but apply them in the public domain in a language and in a way that is accessible to people of the Christian faith, non-Christian faith, or even people of no faith. And Dr. Schluter has been singularly successful in doing this in very many ways around the world. He left Kenya in the early 80s to go back to England and started the Jubilee Center, which was involved and still is involved in public policy campaigns there. He has founded over a dozen social enterprises and companies that have been involved in various aspects of social transformation and public policy reform, all coming out of very solid biblical principles. There are just too many to mention in detail. I can just mention one or two. The Relationships Foundation, which is one of them, has actually come up with what they call a family impact assessment for public policy. It's been adopted in the UK by the Prime Minister there, adopted in Australia by the Prime Minister there. So when they're looking at any new form of policy, whether it's in health, in education, in infrastructure, they do a family assessment and look at the impact on the family unit of those policies. So don't just assume that these policies of development are neutral to the family. So that is one example. He has also formed organizations that have been involved in peace building in South Sudan, in Rwanda. They were very much involved in behind-the-scenes negotiations that helped to broker the peace in South Africa, and many other things that he's done around the world. Prior to the Hesabika conference, Michael Schluter has been talking to small groups, and this morning he was talking to one group at a hotel in town that had very many businessmen, talking about relational capital and the whole idea of how the relationships between companies and their stakeholders is as important, probably more important than even its financial metrics. So he's a very deep thinker, and today he will be talking to us about some of his ideas in the whole area of transforming capitalism and seeing if there are new ways of thinking about capitalism or new models as we look at what economic model to pursue. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in putting your hands together for Dr. Michael Schluter.
So thank you for such a very warm welcome to Daystar. It's great to be back again, and I endorse what James McGarry has said. This place has come a long way since I lectured here back in the late 70s. I think I gave a whole course on a Christian response to contemporary ideologies, and I gave a similar set of lectures down at Nairobi University in 1976 with Dr. Roy Clements. So it's kind of not quite deja vu, but it's great to come back. I hope that the thinking has gone on a long way since those days, and I hope that the kind of ideas that we're talking about today are starting to get traction in international forums, and I hope that you will hear a lot more of them during your lifetime. And I'm looking forward to your questions as well, because I remember being at the same stage that you are now. When I left Kenya, I was kind of try and apply the Bible to public policy, and I felt I had to do it in my own country. I couldn't do it in your country because this is your country, not my country, although I kind of feel sometimes that I'm half Kenyan. But the calling was to try and bring about change in public life. And I hope some of you will sense that calling and will believe enough in the greatness of God that you will feel that you yourselves can make that kind of things that Kenya is famous for around the world. You are thought to be a nation of entrepreneurs who create new things, like your M-Pesa platform leads the world on money transfers. No other country in the world has a third of its GDP going across telephones. And there's no reason why among us in this room today there will not be one or two people who are called out to make dramatic changes in this country. I pray that if that's right, you will get inspiration and seek God for it and pursue it, and not think this is a job. In my early 30s, and I wanted to try. There's a report here called Transforming Capitalism from Within, and I call it. It took about 7 years to work out what is in this report, so this didn't happen overnight. So I used to meet every few weeks, every month perhaps, with a man called Jonathan Rushworth, who was with had just retired from one of the big 5 law firms in the City of London. And kind of difference through Hesabika or through other initiatives that you may start. Because entrepreneurship is one of the of London, with all these top people from the City of London. And he gave me a tip-off that this guy was retiring. So I rang him up and I said, what are you doing next? And he said, I'm not really sure. And I said, well, would you like to help me? And he said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, I need someone to advise me on how to reform the modern corporation in line with biblical thinking. So when we first met, he said this, it was wonderful. He said, I've been working in the city. I charge my time at £500 an hour. I'm willing to sit with you and give you advice. You tell me what you want out of the corporation. I will tell you how to do it. But I will charge you 0 for my time. And I thought, that's a great deal. The bees report, because it's got a cover covered in bees and help us take agendas forward like this. So, I am troubled by capitalism, and I think it does need reform, and I want to explain to you why. But before I explain to you why I think it needs reform and how I think it can be reformed or transformed, let me raise the problem a little bit more acutely. I wonder how many of you in this room are using computers for your studies. Is there anyone who isn't using computers for their studies? So I have an Apple computer. I don't know if you know the value of Apple. I think its last valuation was about $96 billion. That's thousands of millions of dollars. So you wonder, well, what's wrong with having very powerful corporations if they produce equipment like iPads and iPhones and Apple computers? Or you look at Google. What a fantastic source of information that is every time you do an essay. Think of traveling and the cost of traveling from here to any part of the world. The Airbus 380 is a mighty aeroplane. And how could you bring that plane into being without capitalist economics? Or next time you get ill and you need some highly sophisticated pharmaceuticals, think of the size of the companies that produce those pharmaceuticals. I was looking at the largest 10 companies in the world the other day. I think 3 or 4 of them are pharmaceutical companies. Typical value, 300 billion, around there. These are enormous, giant monster companies. But we use their pharmaceuticals. We're grateful for the pharmaceuticals. So then what's the problem? Can we really imagine life without capitalist economics, without capitalist companies? So what troubles me? But I want to ask the question, is capitalism in some sense morally bankrupt? And therefore, does it need change? I'm moving on from that to this. So the evaluation of the morality of an economic system, I suggest, lies in 3 parts, and I shall go through them quite quickly with you. Firstly, the morality of its underlying philosophy. Secondly, the morality of its institutions. And thirdly, the social outcomes, an evaluation of the social outcomes that arise from those institutions. So underlying capitalism are 2 main philosophical trends. The first is individualism, and the second is materialism. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of the name of Adam Smith, but Adam Smith, a Scottish, notice he wasn't English, it's like saying that he came from Oxford instead of Cambridge, which is where I live. But Adam Smith argued that if you allowed everybody to pursue their own self-interest, you got the optimum outcome. I can't remember exactly the quote, and I was hoping I'd find it before today, but I ran out of time. But he said something about the butcher and the baker and the candlestick maker. When they all pursue their self-interest, miraculously, through the operation of the market, you get the perfect allocation of resources and the maximum social benefit, and we're all winners. Now, Adam Smith was an ordained clergyman in Scotland belonging to the church, and I think he genuinely believed that the market was something sent from God and it produced perfect results. I think I will show you quite quickly in a few minutes why it doesn't produce perfect results, but that was the starting point. Let everybody do what they think is best for themselves. Now that contradicts two main lines of thinking that you probably are familiar with. In African thinking, we believe that a person is defined through their relationships. In South Africa, they use the word Ubuntu. Julius Nyerere used the word Ujamaa. I met a very interesting and exciting Kenyan while I've been here called Ben Njiru, and he talks about the word which I had not heard before, Ngwana. And the opposite of Ngwana is Ushenzi. He's trying to argue that uprightness and good relationships are key to human well-being. And if you go to Christian teaching, when Jesus wants to summarize the law, what word does he use to say what summarizes the heart of Christian social ethics? Well, he does not use justice, which you might expect him to use. He does not use family. He does not use stewardship or some environmental word. The word he uses is love. And by love, he means other person-centeredness. Not me-centeredness, but other person-centeredness. This is not about selfies on your cell phone. This is about other people. And Jesus is effectively saying that if you want to practice Christianity, you've got to be thinking more about other people than you think about yourself. And what does that mean if you take it into the field of economics? And indeed, what does it feel like if you bring it into education? Because after all, the proposition I think that every English child has had since they started school aged 5 is that this education is about me. It's about my exam results. It's about my future, my career, my earning capacity. It's about me. That's what we teach our English children. I fear that that may be true in Kenya as well, that the fundamental proposition going from school right through university is that this is about me. I'm not studying now so that I can earn money for my family, or that I can benefit the country, or I can benefit the world. I'm doing this because I want to benefit me. So I'm in competition. If I'm a student, I'm in competition with everybody sitting along my row. I've got to do better than them. Instead of like in Finland, where you have a cooperative approach to education. So take materialism as the second underlying philosophy of capitalism. The company is orientated to make profits for its shareholders. So the company does not exist to benefit the stakeholders, that is, the suppliers, the customers, the investors, it does benefit them, of course, there's the shareholders, but the employees, the regulators, the government, or anybody else, it is just about making money for shareholders, except the senior managers have worked out how to channel off quite a lot of money for themselves. But the point is that this profit motive is at the heart of the capitalist company. And I think what I'm wanting to argue is that we need to change capitalism. I'm not a Marxist, and I'm not a woolly socialist. I believe in the value of markets for goods and services as the most efficient allocative mechanism. I believe there are benefits in the markets for goods and services. I'm raising questions about the markets for the resources, for capital, property, labor. I'm raising questions about those things, as you'll see in a moment. So let's look next at the morality of the institutions of capitalism. Let's look at those institutions for a moment. And I want to start with banks. Now, it's very easy to knock banks. Their employees at the top seem to be making a lot of money, and yet they seem to cause us a lot of problems. And I know you've had 3 bank failures in Kenya in the last 12 months. That's a lot. I think there are 55,000 people who had money in the most recent bank failure, the Chase Bank. That's a lot of people if the government doesn't step in and rescue them. But there's a moral issue going on here, that why does the government step in and rescue a bank? Why doesn't it let it just go bust? Why should other taxpayers have to bail out these banks? If you have your money in Chase Bank, why should your friend who banks at KCB pay money through the tax system to rescue that bank? There are further problems with debt. So the banks in Kenya at the moment seem to be doing a lot of lending to enable people to buy cars. Now, I don't know exactly the size of these loans because I've only heard about it, so I'm guessing maybe 200,000 shillings. You borrow that 200,000 shillings, you buy a car as a debt, you pay interest on that, and if you don't pay it all back, then the bank will come after you to get you, first of all, to give them back the car, and if you can't pay everything back from the car, maybe they will ask for something more than that. Now, the difficulty is, from our studies in Britain, and I haven't done the study here in Kenya, but I'm guessing it's true, half the marriage breakdowns in Britain, half of them, and about half our marriages end in divorce, but half of those divorces can be traced back to money worries. And when people get into debt, they worry. They seriously worry. And what we found when we did a careful study of this was it led not just to divorce, but to child abuse and wives generally getting beaten up by their husbands and all kinds of other horrible things because people get so stressed with debt. And of course, you know in the Bible that Jesus warns against debt, Paul warns against debt, the Old Testament warns against debt and interest. And although sometimes you may be forced to borrow, you may be forced to borrow to be a student here. But as a general rule, the Bible is trying to teach us to avoid debt as much as we can, because debt leads to breakdown of relationship. Look at stock markets. So you put your money into a stock market, and the difficulty is that you may make a profit out of it, but have you taken responsibility for the company where you put your money? You are technically, in some sense, responsible for what the company does. Now, how long do people own shares? Well, the average amount of time across the planet, and this is a slightly misleading figure, but the average amount of time across the planet is 11 seconds. And I have a friend in Cambridge. I have breakfast with him every couple of weeks or so, and he has helped to design a product which allows banks in Chicago to trade shares in half a microsecond. A microsecond is a millionth of a second. So these banks can now trade shares in half a millionth of a second. And they make hundreds of millions of dollars out of doing those trades. And the question I'm asking is, what is the morality of that profit that they make? In what sense do they deserve that profit? You could say, well, they're putting their capital at risk. The share could go down as well as up, so they're taking risk. But are you saying then that the profit is legitimated by the fact you take risk? If that's the case, then is there any difference between trading a share and betting on a horse, or betting on a dog, in dog racing or horse racing, or going to the casino and betting? Is that something as Christians that we feel comfortable with? Or just as human beings, if you're not a Christian, do you feel comfortable that that is what we should be trying to do with our money in order to build the society? Do you support the counties in Kenya who are thinking of building casinos in order to boost their revenue? Or what about corporate structure? Take limited liability. Limited liability says if a company goes bankrupt, then the shareholders do not have to pay up anything except for the original money which they put into the company. Do we feel comfortable about that morally? So here is Donald Trump. In America, I think you've heard of Donald Trump by now. So Donald Trump has, let's say, assets of around $8 million. But he has had, I think it's 6 different companies, it may be 8, no, I think it's 6 different companies that have gone bankrupt. And under Chapter 11 rules in the United States, if your company goes bankrupt, you don't have to pay out the creditors, the people who lent you money or provided you with goods and services. You don't have to pay them out. You can, after 1 or 2 years, I can't remember the exact length of time, you can simply go over to another city or somewhere nearby and start another company, doing the same thing as before, but you leave all the debts behind unpaid. So here's a man who owns so much money, but he's left so many people who provided him with goods and services unpaid, and it's quite legal. Are we comfortable with that? How do you feel about limited liability? I'm going to just mention here a book. So Paul Mills, who some of you know, and myself wrote this book, After Capitalism, Rethinking Economic Relationships. It's a set of 14 essays, and one of them looks at the ethics of limited liability. But it looks at other things. There are a few copies down there, and also some papers I bought if you're interested in looking at the kinds of research materials that we're putting out. So I'm wanting to say that a shareholder acts a little bit like an absentee landlord. Until a few years ago, I put my money into a pension. Pension was run by a large pension company called Standard Life, and I had no idea what my money was used for. I just put my money in there, and I looked to see what rate of return they were giving me on my money. If it was a good rate of return, I was happy. But then I realized that maybe the money was going into pornographic websites, or maybe betting websites. Maybe I, myself, was funding these awful things, which are breaking up families and destroying the dignity of women. I was funding it without knowing it. And then I wonder, I'm a Christian myself, I believe we will appear before Christ on the day of judgment, and he will review our life and ask us about everything we did. So when I meet Christ and he looks at me and he says, hey, Michael, tell me, you put your money in Standard Life, it supported this pornographic website. Now tell me about it. And I'll say, I didn't know my money was going there. And I think Christ will say to me, but Michael, I gave you that money to look after. You were responsible for what happened to it. You can't plead ignorance about that. You should have found out about it. Now, I don't know for sure that's where my money went. And I certainly have changed my pension arrangement now because I realize it was wrong. And yet the majority of Christians in the UK are doing exactly that today as we speak. Because they're not critiquing and thinking about how their funds they have, how their savings are used, where they're being put. I suggest these are flaws in the structure of capitalism which need to be addressed. I'm not saying we should take up guns like a Marxist and go in the marketplace and shoot people. I'm not in that space. But I am saying that as Christians, we have to take seriously the obligation that comes with our wealth, that comes with our positions, to think through these issues and work out ways forward. And I want to suggest some ways forward in a minute. So there are my absentee landlords. I don't know if you think they look realistic. They're sitting with their computers at home. They're playing the stock exchange, trying to make some money, but they're taking no responsibility for what the companies do. So we came up with a slogan. It isn't quite on there, so you'll have to listen carefully. In the American Revolution against Britain, of course they were unwise to rebel against Britain, but that's another story. But in this American Revolution against Britain in 1780, the revolutionaries had a slogan that was a very powerful slogan. The slogan was, "No taxation without representation." If you want to tax us, you must give us a vote. And I'm afraid I have to say I think they were right. I think they were right. No taxation without representation. So here is my slogan for you to take home and think about. My slogan is this: no reward without responsibility. No reward without responsibility. Now it goes on. Second part of it is no investment without involvement. If you want to own shares, that's fine, but you take responsibility and get involved with how the money is used. No investment without involvement. And the third part of it is this: no profit without participation. No reward without responsibility. No investment without involvement. No profit without participation. I'll come back to mobility of capital in a minute. So I'm now on to part 3, the social outcomes arising from the way capitalism operates. First of all, there is giantism. So Google is a very, 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 very large company. I think you all know that. And at the moment, the European Commission in Europe has got various antitrust cases going against Google because they're saying they are manipulating things in the market for apps and other parts of the IT market to prevent competition. Because if you're that powerful, you do what you please. And in Britain, Google is very unpopular because it doesn't pay any tax. So it takes an enormous amount of money out of Britain, billions of pounds or dollars a year, but it pays no tax in the UK at all. Because it says, oh no, but we're operating out of Luxembourg. We're really a Luxembourg company and we have this offshoot in Britain doing all this stuff. Luxembourg is tiny. But they arrange for all the profit to come from that Luxembourg company in order to avoid paying tax. Or maybe from the Cayman Islands, or the British Virgin Islands, or somewhere where there's no tax. But it's corrupt. But nobody is able to force them to pay tax because they're so big. So they're getting a terrible reputation. Here is debt as a percentage of tax revenue. Now, this is all European Union data. I'm sorry for that. I think your Kenya level of debt as a percentage of your GDP is about 49%, which means it's probably about 100% of tax revenue. That means you need a whole year of tax revenue to pay back the debts you've already got. A whole year of tax revenue. How do you get that amount of money to pay back debts? But look at Greece. Nearly 5 times its total tax revenue every year. That means 5 years of all the tax they collect ought to be used to pay back their debts. Now, paying back a debt is a serious business within a Christian worldview. And I think within any moral worldview. If you take this capital and you never pay it back, it amounts to stealing, actually. Now, there are exceptions to that where the donors come together and they let you off the debt. That's fine. But for an awful lot of situations, they don't want to let you off the debt willingly. And this is crushing for any economic growth or recovery. And the problem is in the UK, look at that UK figure there, the problem is that my generation has borrowed this money to make our lives better. In my generation, better health services. Who uses the health service? Older people like me. I think I'm an older person. I don't know, maybe. I'm an older person. I use the health service more than the young people like you. So we are the beneficiaries of this money. And we have locked in to our public policy the fact that we will get a 2.5% increase in our pensions every year, even if inflation is 0. Now, that means we are guaranteed a better and better and better lifestyle every year. Whatever's happening to young people, whatever's happening to the unemployed, we don't care. We're just going to make sure we get the best deal, and we're doing it by borrowing a lot of money. Who is going to pay the money back? Well, it's my children and my grandchildren. I'm leaving this debt for them to pay back. What is the justice between generations going on here? This is gross injustice. But it's brought about by a debt-based mindset, which I believe is part of the way capitalism works. Or look at this pay differential. We did a little bit of work looking at supermarkets in Britain, and we compared the wage of the person who stands 8 hours a day at the checkout with the wage of the chief executive of our major corporates in Britain. So you see the little one? That's the checkout lady. And you see the chief executive? That's his or her salary. Now, is it fair that somebody working on the checkout, who works 8 hours a day standing there, rather a boring job, has to work for 500 years to earn the salary of the chief executive? Is that right? Is that fair? Do you feel good about that? And I don't know what the number is. I don't know if Roy is here, but he might look into it for me and let me know. But I suspect that in Kenya it's 1 to 1,000. I suspect. In South Africa, it's 1 to 1,000, roughly. So get your head round that. So in 1920, there was a very famous banker in New York, and he said that he thought that pay differentials should never exceed 20 to 1. You should never need to pay one person more than 20 times another person. If you go back just to 1960, I was alive in 1960. I think you weren't, most of you weren't alive in 1960. But in 1960, in the British Navy, the top admiral in the fleet was paid 10 times more than the bottom seaman. Only a 10 times difference. Now we're talking about 500 to 1 as not being that unusual. It makes you ask some questions about social outcomes. Here are the levels of youth unemployment. Sorry, just a moment. Here are the levels of youth unemployment across Europe. Again, I'm sorry, I'm not showing you African numbers. But in Europe, we used to have every country in Europe below 20% of youth unemployed. Now look at those figures. Greece, nearly 60% of young people between 16 and 24 who are not in full-time employment are unemployed. Those are terrible statistics and result in terrible suffering. How do people in Spain or in Portugal, how do they get married? How do they set up a separate home, separate from their parents? How can they ever leave living at home if they're unemployed? What kind of life are they going to lead? And by the look of it, they're going to be unemployed like that for the next 20, 25 years. They will probably never, ever have a job. There must be a better way to organize the economy than that. So it results in what we call relational poverty. This is a picture by a painter called Lowry, and you can see these stick men and women are all walking by themselves. These are not communities, these are not families or households, these are individuals. And the scene is an industrial scene. in the UK. But that's where it ends up, with every person fighting for themselves. So what I found as I've gone around the world, I have a daughter who lives in Japan, I've been to South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, been quite a lot around Asia now, that they are working on average about 70 hours a week, and on average they'd be commuting 1 to 2 hours each way, each day. And then these young people say to me, but we never have a chance to build a relationship which leads to a marriage. We just don't have time, because we have to work these incredibly long hours. And of course, if they do get married, they probably are both working, they don't have time to look after children. It's too much hassle. So they're losing, these Asian countries, about a third of their workforce every 30 to 40 years. A third of their workforce. I think by the year 2200, Japan will have a population on current estimates of about 7 million. Currently it's about 120, 130 million, but it will be down to 7 million by then. They are wiping themselves off the planet unless they change. But by then anyway, they probably would have been overtaken by China, because they haven't got enough people to serve in the armed forces. You can't sustain an economy without a workforce. But that problem is equally acute in a country like Germany, which is why they're welcoming so many immigrants. So where next? How do we tackle this? What is the reform process? Well, let me give you some thoughts. Copernicus was a Polish scientist, and in 1536 he published a book, and the book said this: you know, you can see the sun, it comes up in the morning over here, it goes down in the evening over there. And so everyone had concluded that of course the sun goes around the earth, you can see it. And he said, actually that's wrong. He said, in fact what happens is that the earth goes round the sun. The earth, in fact, goes round the sun. I can prove it by showing you what happens to the planets. So it took about 100 years for people to accept that idea. So the question is, if you, at the moment in the West, we tend to put the sun is representative of money. We put money at the center of our thought universe, and we make relationships, all kinds of relationships, spin around this money to maximize the amount of capital that we are producing in our society. And we call a developed country a country with a lot of capital and high incomes. That is a sign of the materialism. So if you read The Economist magazine, produced in London, it will refer to developed countries as Britain, France, Germany, America, and so on, Australia, and it will refer to developing countries as places like Kenya. And we somehow look down our noses at you people in Africa and say, you know, we're developed and you are developing and you've got to become like us. Do you really want to become like us? We have 571,000 children on our at-risk child abuse register. We have 3.7 million children in Britain who are in the court system. We have half our marriages that end in divorce. We have nearly half our children born outside marriage. Is that the kind of society you want? Okay, so what is a developed country then? What does it look like? What does it look like? And if you're going to use this word development, don't use it again until you know what it means, until you have defined what you think it should mean. Because I think Kenya is more developed than Britain, actually, within my relational worldview. So I'm looking for a change of worldview to put relationships at the center of the way we think. That leads us to, I realize I'm over time now, so I need to be drawing to a close. That leads to a change in our institutions, because worldview and values will always shift over to institutions. So we're looking for relational companies, relational finance, relational schools, relational families. And I could spend another lecture here one day describing what those look like. We need to shift our values. So when you leave here and you go out in the working world, you will face a choice as to whether your headspace, whether your thinking and priorities are around building, investing time in relationships, or whether you go down a route which is about making money and you don't have much time for the relationships and you just use your relationships to make money. That will be a fundamental choice you will end up making. Can I encourage you, within Christian thinking and tradition, or just perhaps through African thinking and tradition, to keep your priorities around relationships in the use of your time? Who do you have lunch with? Who do you meet up with in the evenings? Which are the important things really in your life? I'm a bit of a rebel around human rights. I know the arguments for human rights. I know they've done great good in the world since 1947 when the UN passed its initial Charter of Human Rights. But I think they've become a charter for selfishness. Too much they've become a charter for selfishness. And I'm suggesting that often now human rights denies justice, because you're not thinking about the rights of other people. It comes through very clearly in sexual ethics in Britain. You have a right to have sex as an adult with whoever you want. But no one is saying to you, but hang on a minute, who else is going to be affected by your sexual act? Maybe you pass on chlamydia to the other person and they will never have children. Maybe a child is born and the taxpayer will pick up the bill, and it won't be you, or your parents will be left looking after the child because you haven't got time to look after the child. Is it fair? Maybe you'll even be forced to an abortion if you're a woman, because you get under pressure from people who say you must have an abortion and kill the child. But is that fair on you or on the child? If you're a migrant, are we thinking about only the welfare of the migrant? Because that's what the court says. Human rights are determined by courts, and the judge is only looking at the person in front of them and saying, what is fair for you as an individual? They're not looking at what is fair for you in the context of what is fair for everybody else. So what is fair for the migrant and what is fair for the unemployed person who doesn't have access to a home or a job in the country to which the migrant is coming? How do you balance those rights? It's very difficult. I'm not saying be nasty to migrants. I'm simply saying weigh up. If you're going to use the language of rights, be very careful you're not denying justice. And I'm also saying think about competition in the context of grace. Grace is one of the great Christian words, and I suggest one way to think about grace is the word generosity. God is incredibly generous to us. Are we generous to other people? Are we generous to people of other ethnic groups that are different from ours? Do we speak against them privately? Do we hold anger against them privately for something that happened in the past? When I worked in Rwanda after the genocide for 5 years, I suddenly learned something about the Lord's Prayer. Do you know, it does not say, forgive me my trespasses as I forgive those who trespass against me. What it says is, forgive us our trespasses or our sins as we forgive those who trespass against us, who sin against us. And talking to Tutsis and Hutus, there was an issue about, are we willing to forgive the people of the other ethnic group who we feel have wronged us? Because if we won't forgive them, Christ says that he will not forgive us. And that applies not just individually, but to us as an ethnic or racial group. Competition is about me. Competition is not just about saying that I must succeed. It's also about the fact that others must fail. It's a bit hard, isn't it? Competition is not just about the fact that I should succeed. It's about the fact that others should fail. Do we want to end up like that? Do we want to go there? And I wonder if we need also to change our understanding of God, because I think missionaries brought to Africa an idea about Christianity which said, what matters is that you love God. You must love God. Loving God matters more than anything else in the world. It's the first commandment, which of course it is. But when Jesus is asked to summarize the commandments, he says, I cannot do it in one commandment. I have to give you two commandments. Love God and love your neighbor. And Jesus says that if you cannot love your neighbor, and he gives the illustration of the Samaritan, the person from the other ethnic group who you come across who's in need one day, if you cannot love your neighbor, if you're not prepared to say no to bribery and corruption on Monday, then he says don't bother to come to church on Sunday, because the whole thing is a sham. You cannot simply worship God on a Sunday, offer up sacrifices to God, put money in the collection, whatever, and then go out and cheat people and take bribes on Monday. You can't do it. This is not genuine Christianity. This is a sham. It's false. You have to keep those two commandments together. Well, I've said an awful lot. I hope there are some questions. I can't be too long. I should be chased up by Joshua for Hesabika meeting in Kenyatta University this evening. But just for websites, there's an online course you can do on a site which is called Jubilee-Center, jubilee-center.org. They are running the next one, I think, in October for 6 weeks to get into relational thinking from a Christian point of view. If you're interested in looking at it from the point of view of public policy, where not everyone is a Christian, it goes on and on. You'll find them on relationalthinking.net if you want to explore the relational idea further. So in this Transforming Capitalism from Within, which I hope you'll find in your library, we produced a relational business charter for companies which gives 10 major points that we thought companies should adhere to on pay differentials, on how long they take to pay suppliers, on whether they pay their taxes, all sorts of things. And we suggest, like a credit ratings agency, we suggest a relational ratings agency. So if you want to explore those ideas, they're set out in this publication.
Thank you very much. Can we put our hands together? I have requested Dr. Schroeter to sit here so that he can probably respond to questions and comments if we have any. There is a microphone that is passing around. Yeah, okay. I already see a hand. Thank you, sir.
Thanks again, Dr. Schluter, for the interesting talk. My name is Tim. I come from the Strathmore University. Strathmore University. I was at the talk with, Dr. Paul Mills was with us on Wednesday. So you raised some interesting thoughts about relational capital, the relational idea. So I was wondering, there's something wrong with capitalism, and so are the tools to integrate the relational aspect into public policy? Like I want to see like a clear link between now your relational idea and public policy in countries like Kenya. Is there a way to integrate your idea into public policy currently? That's my question. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's have three.
Before asking these questions, I would like to give a definition of capitalism to put my questions into perspective. Capitalism, the definition is not in any book you can find, but according to me, it is organized, market-driven anarchy. And so we have economists in this room. I say organized, market-driven anarchy. That's, according to me, that's what capitalism is. And I'd like to ask this question: what do you think? The capitalism, as I've seen practiced in some African countries, is so ruthless to the point that the common people or the ordinary Africans are made to be subservient to the ruling elite based on the kind of capitalism that is practiced. We see it's even more than the capitalist Western society that we've seen in some African countries. That's the first question. What do you think drives this kind of ruthlessness? Then the second question is, what significant difference do you see in the application of law in African countries and the upholding of the rule of law between African countries and Western countries in looking at capitalism? Thank you.
I just have a question. In my studies in finance, capital markets and all this, and as I look to pursue my PhD in finance, my question is, I've struggled with the issue of poverty traps in Africa. And poverty traps, I'm sure you're aware of them. The various things that are endemic in the African situation that lead people to stay in abject poverty. Health, maternity, joblessness, education or lack of education. My question basically is that capitalism, with its big companies that offer employment in a region of a lot of poverty, in a region with poverty traps, how can we think relationally while meeting the needs of the poor in society, who do need the jobs, who do need big corporates to sponsor health programs and education and scholarships? How can we think relationally, effectively, as Christians, as we should, and still address these issues that affect Africa and other poverty-stricken areas? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting questions. Thank you all who asked questions. Thank you very much. So I think the first question was, if you take this relational idea, how would you apply it through public policy in Kenya? Well, I could spend all day throwing out ideas to you. I think while I've been here, people have been interested in having a family impact analysis on all legislation going through the Kenya Parliament. We had a seminar last night on the case against a debt-driven growth strategy for Kenya. So how would you grow the economy without using a lot of debt? What would it look like? Let's define what the strategy looks like. And that was from somebody from the IMF talking in his personal capacity. I think those talk notes will be available eventually from the Hesabika website. I hope that's right, isn't it, Joshua? So hopefully if you go to that in a few weeks' time, you'll find his talk. But it will give you a set of practical ideas in that regard. So how do you produce less debt? I think thinking about how the education system is organized in terms of school design and curriculum design and implementation and forms of examination and so on. If you go on the Relational Schools website, there's a lot of material on there. It's had 750,000 hits in 2 years. Or come to the Hesabika convention and meet Dr. Robert Lowe, who is leading that initiative in Britain and Australia and other countries, and talk to him about it. But some of those ideas, a lot of those ideas may be absolutely relevant in Kenya. In terms of job creation, I spent 5 years in the rural areas of Kenya seeking to create jobs. And this also bears on another question that was asked about the poverty traps. It's very interesting that if you read the Jubilee Roadmap paper, there's some copies over there, you will see that in the way that biblical law is structured with the Jubilee and so on, one of the major emphases is to make sure that everybody has access to some land. That everyone has access to land, and you couldn't buy and sell land like you buy and sell a used car. You were not allowed to, because the land was owned not just by the household, but by the clan and the tribe in Old Testament Israel. And it would always be owned by that community. And the aim was that everybody should have access to land. That was the goal. Even if they didn't have it every single year of their lives, they would have it for a substantial part of their lives. And if you have land, it does give you a chance to earn some income for yourself and to have some way out of poverty. What I was saying at this morning's seminar, which also will probably go on the website on relational capital, is that companies should start measuring their stakeholder relationships and reporting on them every month at the company's board meetings and also in their annual report and accounts. Your thunder's very impressive in this country, isn't it? We don't often have it that loud in England. So I think the measurement and reporting on stakeholder relationships, that is, companies starting to measure the quality of relationships that they have with their suppliers, their customers, their investors, their regulators, their employees, of course, and so on. If companies started to do that and discuss it in the boardroom, that is what is being required now in South Africa, or proposed in South Africa in the King IV Corporate Governance Code. You would be starting to move towards relational companies. And this doesn't require a machine gun. It requires a shift in the law and in focus and emphasis and people's attention. And Mervyn King, who's the chairman of the King IV Drafting Committee and also chairman of the International Integrated Reporting Council, is suggesting that companies appoint a chief stakeholder relationship officer. So that companies have not just a chief executive and a chief financial officer, but they also have a chief stakeholder relationship officer. Because he says it's that important to know what your stakeholders are thinking about you, as well as communicating what the company is thinking about them. It must be a two-way flow of information. I think I've said enough about that. As far as the application of law in African and Western countries are concerned, one of the big law firms in the city is called Linklaters. It has just published a paper which you can download from their website on the rule of law in Britain, with a lot of case material showing how the rule of law is being destroyed in Britain at the moment by government decision making. So whereas before we would never have legislation that applied backwards in time, we're now starting to have legislation that does apply backwards in time. How can you possibly be taken to court for failing to obey a law that never even existed when you committed your act? It must be unfair. So the rule of law is something very precious. I believe it came about through Christian culture. But why are we not protecting that in Britain? And how do you introduce it more firmly into Africa? I can't possibly answer that in 5 minutes. It's a much bigger part of social change, and it's not going to be achieved in 5 minutes. But I do recommend looking at the paper on the Linklaters website. That's Linklaters, Linklaters. On the poverty trap in Africa, we also have, of course, the poverty trap in Britain. It's Moses, isn't it? I certainly have to agree that there are a lot of people who will never probably climb out of poverty. There's a really interesting paper put out by the United Nations Environment Programme from Geneva. Again, you can download it, I suspect, free from their website, UNEP Geneva. And it's called Relationships and Resilience. And what it argues is that if you look at the Sahel part of Africa, the individuals and the families that are most resilient to drought and extreme negative conditions are those with strong relationships. and it pans across to some thinking by a sociologist at Harvard called Robert Putnam, who suggests that there are two kinds of relationships to think about in public life. There's bonding relationships and bridging relationships. Bonding relationships are the kind of relationships you have in your immediate family and community. And bridging relationships are the relationships you have through being at Daystar University, meeting lots of interesting people. One of them goes off and becomes a doctor somewhere. You remember him. Then your child is ill at home. You are in an emergency. Your wife or husband, your children can't help you. They're none of them doctors, but you remember this guy. So you ring him up at 3 o'clock in the morning. Say, I'm really sorry to disturb you, John, but I need some help. This is what is happening to my son. He's frothing at the mouth. I don't know what to do. What should I do? Do I have to go to the hospital? Is there anything else I can do? And because you get some information from a long way away, you are able to cope. Now, the issues are what results in people having strong bonding relationships in their immediate family to help them in their immediate context, and what results in them having strong bridging relationships that they can call on in a time of need. But behind that, there is a deeper question. And the deeper question is, how do you escape victimhood? Because if you have a victim mentality, I am in this situation because of the politicians. I'm in this situation because of what the rich people are doing to me. Then of course you're never going to climb out of it, because you're waiting for your rights to be satisfied by someone over whom you have no influence. There has to be the attitude within your own heart that says, yes, I believe through prayer, through determination, through commitment, through faithfulness, actually through the intervention of God in some way, I can climb out of this situation I'm in and come to somewhere in a better place. And what brings that about? It's around faith. It's about your relationship with God, and as I mentioned already, your relationship with other people. But to escape victimhood, I think, is crucial. And I could send you an email I received from an American friend recently around the concept of victimhood. Didn't agree with everything he said, but he was writing in the Huffington Post and on victimhood, and saying that this is the most crushing problem now in the United States, he thinks. So I think you're onto the right question. Thank you.
This is very interesting for me as an economist, and you seem to be destroying my foundation from Adam Smith. And I ask myself, there's a scripture that says, if the foundation are destroyed, then what will people do? What will the righteous do? And I'm asking this because the profit motive basically is in terms of the way entrepreneurs look at it. It is the profit motive that drives them. It is the profit motive that drives Google, for example. Now, in the absence of that profit motive, what is it that will drive development? And therefore, if we move away from the profit motive, from individualism, from also materialism, because this is what drives people to wake up very early and work very hard, you know. Then won't we have a collapse before the other system comes into place? And therefore, are we seeing a new theory that is coming up? And maybe the other aspect is how far in terms of empirical analysis is this proposed, let me call it theory? How far has it been proven to work before you can ask me to stop believing in Adam Smith and join you? Thank you.
Let's go at the back. I have seen the VC.
Hello, Dr. Schulte. My question is, what has been the reception generally across the board from economists in as far as relational thinking is concerned? Because I agree with Dr. Bowen there that this is really a paradigm shift. And if, say, an economy like Kenya were to take up this theory, how long would it take for us to see actually some serious changes and enjoy the benefits of this? Would it be in our generation or 50 years to come?
I highly appreciate the talk, and what you're putting forward is certainly biblical and the right direction. So I ask, in the time that you have advanced it in UK, what gains have you made within that culture or within that government? You made reference to Jamaa, which to the Tanzanians it was a failure. You made reference to Ubuntu, which certainly is nothing to be copied. It's not making much gains. I think what I'm still referring to what Professor Bowen is saying. It's great, it's right direction. How do we anchor it in a social structure that is not Christian itself, and yet this needs to have some level of traction? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Brooke. I'm from a totally different department, that is from clinical psychology, but I have a concern in issues pertaining to humanity or human rights, because speaking of economics, at the end of the day, we touch strings, or we touch the issue of human rights. So recently I was making my own mini studies on why we lack, especially in Africa or all over the world, and I was questioning myself, isn't there enough of resources in the world? And I came to the point to realize that this world has sustained about 108 billion people so far, right? 108 billion people lived on this earth, and all of them lived having something. And then how comes that we are 7 billion of people in this advanced 21st century, and then we can't sustain ourselves? Is it because of lack of willingness and lack of it's not because of lack of resources? I'm sure I made my own research, even beginning with the extent of oxygen that could sustain our lives, and any other resources are in abundance in this world. But we're saying that the world is governed by capitalist economy to a greater extent, and this capitalist economy is the one which has bound resources in its own hands, and then people are not having enough. So where is the problem? Is it in the lack of political willingness, or a lack of economic mismanagement? So I would like you to answer this. Thank you
for that lecture. My name is Susan. I'm a staff member here at Daystar. There's something you said about your investment in a pension scheme, and I was wondering, how should Christians then invest in a morally bankrupt capitalist society? Where should we invest? And even for institutions, are we in the right direction when we follow a capitalist nature? For example, thinking of Daystar, it's probably rated as one of the most expensive universities. Are we propagating still the same capitalist nature that we as Christians are supposed to be thinking differently? Thank you.
So I would want to argue that that God's relational design for a relational society is contained in biblical law, interpreted now through the New Testament. So I believe God reveals to us how to run a society. I don't think he leaves us to imagine it all. And it's interesting that the rules are much more around, for example, finance than around economics. there's a lot to do with capital, a lot to do with labor and land around resources, if you like, and the fact that they're all subject to collective constraints. They're not free to the market. You don't simply say, well, you can just do with your capital whatever you like, wherever you want. You are bound by a ban on interest, by every 7 years that all debts are written off to your fellow citizens, and all those other laws. And I would want to say, well, Jesus said that human beings shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. But that somehow as Christians we have put Old Testament law into the dustbin. We just don't go back and study it. And that's where I started in Kenya in 1976, when my pastor said to me here at Nairobi Baptist Church, he'd just given a series of talks on capitalism, Marxism, and socialism, a biblical critique. At the end of the talks, I said to him, do you think there is a Christian or biblical alternative? And he said to me, I don't think the answer lies in the kingdom of God, because that's where people have a faith in God. I believe it lies in Old Testament law, where Jesus says people are subject to the hardness of the human heart. When he's discussing divorce, you may remember. So I think Old Testament law assumes hardness of heart. Now, if you take Old Testament law as your source, which is what we've done at the Jubilee Center for the since 1982, if you take that as your source, you obviously can't apply the law literally, so what you end up doing is taking principles from the law. But you can't take the principles one by one, unlinked to each other, because each of these areas touches on the others. So if you don't have a control over your land market and you bring in the ban on interest in your capital market, everyone will shift their capital out of business and into buying land. And that's the one thing you don't want, because it's unproductive and it destroys people's homes. These things are all linked together. And the Jubilee Roadmap document there is an introduction to that, but then it goes a step further in a book we wrote called Jubilee Manifesto, where we discuss even things like the monetary system and all kinds of other stuff that's in there. Now the question is, does it work? And I believe that any nation that honors God in that way will find it works, that it will have God's blessing, kind of blessing that's described at the end of Deuteronomy. There's no guarantee in the Bible about individual blessing for obedience, but there's plenty in the Bible about national blessing for obedience. So theologically, that's how I would come to it. Now, we're operating in a secular society in Britain, and in a sense you are in Kenya, as one of the speakers mentioned. You know, Kenya at one level has 80% nominally Christian, 50% go to church on a Sunday, whatever the number is. But you've got a lot of Muslims in the society. You can't have a social reform movement that says the Bible says so, we must do this. So the way we have done this, the way we've crafted it in the work we've done, is to say that we believe in the relational values of the Judeo-Christian tradition. We spell that out on the Relational Thinking website. What are those values? And then we use the language of relationships as the core and heart of what the Christian thinking is all about, and say, we will use the language of relationships to say we want relational companies, relational stakeholders, relational projects, relational schools, relational hospitals, relational prisons. We spread it out that way. Now, the question is, will it produce higher GDP? But that, in a sense, is itself a money-driven, profit-driven mindset, which the Bible is actually opposed to. I think a better question would be, will it bring greater relational well-being? Will you be happier? Will you have greater contentment? Will it result in less disease, less mental illness, less trouble in families, less marriage breakdown, less tragedy in the lives of young people growing up? Will it result in more employment, even if we are a little bit poorer than we would have been at a national average level through GDP? Will it resolve the problems of ethnic tension? that are deep and troubling in this country as you approach another election? And I think the answer to that is definitely it will have a huge positive impact. So I would want to say that I think economics provides some very useful tools. I certainly believe that the Bible supports the idea about using markets for the allocation of resources in terms of goods and services and that kind of society. But again, I think that Adam Smith was driven through Western individualism, which had come from Descartes and before. And if you look, for example, at the most successful education system in the world, the one with the highest results in maths and science and so on, it's actually Finland, not America or Britain. And Finland has a highly cooperative approach to education. So instead of the schools being ranked in order by how good they are, the good schools deliberately go and help the bad schools, which you'd never see in Britain because they're going to compete for students. And the good students help the worst students. And the result is you actually get a better overall outcome. Now, what I'm suggesting is that these things fit in deeply with where Africa, as I've known it in my lifetime, has come from. And what troubles me deeply as I come back to Africa after some time away is that I see a growth of individualism coming in and also materialism, which is contrary to the values that I used to discuss with all my African mates and friends, when I lived here in the 70s, and where they were teaching me as an individualist how to think relationally, which came out of their cultural context. So it's a very tough question you've asked me. If you say, are there results to prove it, I would say Rob Lowe, who runs the Relational Schools Project, did his PhD on school results in Britain, and he was able to show quite conclusively that when schools, for example, brought the sport and the drama and the music into the school day, instead of running it at the end of the school day, so half the students went home, half stayed for music and sport and stuff. When they brought it into the middle of the school day, so all the students were involved, the quality of the relationships among the students was much better, and the exam results were much better. He was able to show also the link between the quality of the relationship between the teacher and the student and the amount of progress that the students were making in their academic studies. So I think there is quite a body of evidence. And also, if you look at the most successful companies in the world, they actually are ones that show high levels of relational capital. So take Tata, for example, the huge steel company. Sorry to spend so much time talking to you, but take Tata, for example, a very big Indian steel company. When the terrorists attacked the Taj Mahal Hotel a few years ago and 175 people were killed, there were 600 staff of the Taj Mahal Hotel, which was owned by Tata, in the hotel at the time. None of them made a run for it. Not one of them made a run for it. They all helped the hotel guests to escape the building as best they could, and 11 of them died in the process. At the end of that, the chairman of the whole enormous Tata company went to every single funeral of those 11 people and visited all the 80 families who had had injured people in that attack. Every one of them was visited by the chairman of the company. He was making a statement that relationships matter in this company. Do you think that has boosted Tata sales? Do you think it has brought him goodwill in the Indian population? Supposing he'd gone back to his office and say, now tomorrow it must be business as usual, we need to keep making money. It's a complex set of questions. But thank you for asking, and I hope you will read some of our stuff, because I think you'd enjoy it, although it is a little radical in places. And Paul Mills, who's been here with Hesabika this week, is a top IMF economist. He's here in his personal capacity, speaking to audiences that are not public audiences, because he can't do that because of his position. But in the papers he's written, and there are lots of them in that book, After Capitalism, for example, he is saying, look, as an economist, this is how economically it works out. So he was forced at some point to reevaluate his whole economic position from a biblical point of view in a rigorous way. How quickly would we see benefits from relational thinking? Well, we're suggesting a transition process. We're not suggesting everything's abolished tomorrow. We're suggesting a process because you have to carry people with you. You cannot bring about social change unless you persuade people that you're right. So there has to be a growing movement, if you like, of people who think in this relational way, who persuade other people in Kenya that this is the right way to go. You must achieve this through consent, to be relational. And that is a huge agenda for the next 10, 20, 30 years. But if you want a different Kenya in 30 years, you must start now, not wait for 30 years and think it can happen overnight. So I think the benefits will be seen in some ways quite quickly. If companies start to take seriously their stakeholder relationships, and that is required, by the way, in large projects now. It's a constitutional requirement that in large public projects, the stakeholder relationships must be assessed and must be in good health for the project to be allowed to proceed by the courts. So I think if you start doing that with your projects, whether they're public sector or private sector, you will see real tangible benefits quite quickly. But other things, like changes in schools and so on, will take quite a number of years to come through. In the UK, what gains have we made? Well, I ran a campaign against Mrs. Thatcher on the issue of Sunday shopping, because the British government, for a number of years now, since about actually 1985, 1983, it goes right back there, have wanted to go 24/7, particularly the Conservative Party. They think, let's sweat our assets, is the phrase. Let's make our hospitals more productive. Let's make them work 24/7, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We want a 24/7 health service. We want 24/7 shopping. We want to be highly productive, highly efficient. Let's get rid of all constraints. So we fought them on that, and we won against Mrs. Thatcher, the only bill she lost in Parliament in her time in office in 1986. But it came up again just about 4 weeks ago, because there was a compromise in 1994 which said the big shops could open, in 1994, the big shops could open from 10 in the morning till 6 in the evening, any 6 hours in that 8-hour period. And they wanted to sweep away that restriction just 3-4 weeks ago. And we had another big battle in Parliament about that. But what was interesting this time was that the media, who'd always been against us in the earlier campaign, are now starting to move across and recognize that actually some balance between work and rest is a very good idea. So we are winning the argument. And Keep Sunday Special, which started as a church-based campaign, the unions, the trade unions and the shopkeepers came to us and they said, we would like to use your campaign slogan, "Is that all right with you?" And we said, yes, that's fine with us as long as you keep the churches involved. But now this brand is now a brand owned by secular organizations in Britain. Keep Sunday Special. Now we're saying Christians should not only not work themselves, but they should not make other people work. So they should not go shopping on a Sunday because they're making other people work. They should not let their children do homework on a Sunday because Exodus says, you shall not work nor your children. We should keep Sunday as a day for relationship with God and relationships with other people. Sunday is relationships day every week. That's how we bring it into our daily lives. But it's quite a shift for Christians not to come out of the church just here and go shopping. It's a huge mind shift. Is the problem fundamentally economic or political? I'm convinced it's political. Looking for the man who asked the question at the back. It's a question of whether we want to do it. And that's a matter of winning over hearts and minds. Susan, as far as my own savings are concerned, my own pension is concerned, I believe that what I've done is I've put some of my own pension into local companies in Cambridge. And I will go along to their annual meetings and I will make a fuss if I think they're doing things that are unhealthy and wrong. So I'm starting to track these 4 companies. Now, my economics friend says, oh, but you should have 20 companies, you reduce the risk, da-da-da-da. And I'm saying, no, I don't want to do that because I'm not interested in the risk. I'm interested in, if I get a return from those companies, that I have made some contribution. How do I make the contribution? I track the company's behavior, I go to the annual general meeting, I engage with it. Now, the person who really thinks about this is Paul Mills. I hope he's going to do a seminar on it at Hesabika. I don't know if you'll get there, maybe it will be recorded. But he's the expert on personal finance within a Christian framework. How do we deal with insurance and pensions and all of the student debt, all these things, which are urgent questions in our generation, within the biblical paradigm that we are promoting? I must stop there, I think. I'm sorry I haven't covered everything. Thank you.
I want to welcome Ezekiel Baraza to make a small announcement about registration to Hesabika convention, after which Mr. Evans Amata will come and move vote of thanks. He will.
Thank you so much. My name is Ezekiel Baraza. I work with Focus Kenya as the Student Ministry Director. I'm here just to invite those of us who may not have yet registered for Hesabika and have that opportunity, and I would really encourage as many as are seated here to register. We have registration forms for Hesabika. The cost of Hesabika, as you may have seen on the clip, is 5,000 shillings if you are coming for all the 3 days, and 2,000 shillings per day if you are coming for just few of the days, or per day, that is. And so we do have registration forms for Hesabika, and I'll be seated at the back of the hall. I want to invite all of us to come and pick a form, fill it, and we meet at Hesabika convention starting tomorrow through to Monday. Thank you and God bless you.
Good afternoon to you. I must say that for the short time we've been here, I think we've learned a lot. I think I would say the speaker has touched on almost every aspect of Kenyan life. We could even cite examples, because my area is in finance, and I'm also so much into economics. And what you spoke about has some examples to give. We know in Kenya that the highest paid CEO would be earning more than 10 million shillings. Yet there's somebody earning 5,000 shillings per month. So it's a real kind of lesson. It's something that has really, in a way, exposed us to reflect on it and see what we can do. Mine is just to give a vote of thanks. Let's start by, first of all, thanking God that He's able to give us life, and He was able to enable us to be here, present, to listen to this great lecture. We really want to thank Him for everything that has happened this afternoon. Then perhaps to thank Dr. Schluter for having taken time even to put together that lecture, which was quite powerful. And I think for many years we may have to remember your words, which I think has challenged us in so many ways. I know that we had even people outside economics who got interested in economics. That tells you that the talk was powerful. I also wish to thank Hesabika for having allowed us to really host this talk. We really want to thank you, and we want to congratulate you for this initiative, the initiative of having to change the society. As Dr. Schluter says, we go relational, and of course, having a paradigm shift from what we have known, capitalism, to something else, which he's proposing in his talk. I want to thank the planning committee led by Professor Waidhima and also assisted by the School of Business and Economics for having put together this public lecture. We really look forward to having many more. And I told Dr. Schluter that this will not be the last. Perhaps we may want to have many, many more talks like this one. I want to thank the administration, the Vice Chancellor and the Deputy Vice Chancellor for their support, for their encouragement. And I want to thank us all for having left all what you're doing just to come and make this event a success. Could we just appreciate each one of us? Now, as I just wind up before I pray, I want to make an announcement that we have some books here on sale. I'm told that Roy will be the one in charge. I don't know how much they are going for, but perhaps find out from Roy. With that, just before we break off, could we just pray? Maybe we stand just to pray. Father, we want to thank you for this great afternoon that you gave to us, for the way you prepared the speaker of today who has come and he has talked to us. And we pray that whatever he talked to us about is going to help us even in the way we relate to one another. We want to commit even the speaker and Hesabika group, even as they go to organize and have the workshop. We pray that you're going to be with them. Your presence is going to lead and you're going to guide whatever will be done in this workshop. Lord, as we leave this place, we pray that you're going to be with us, protect us on the way, and Lord, we're going to give you all the honor and glory. We want to thank you even for this institution, the institution that is known by your name. We pray that you're going to guide us even as we relate to one another and even as we relate to others outside this institution. We just thank you and we bless you, for in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Yeah, thank you.
We will translate conscience into